Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. When John and Marlene Strege faced the devastating news that they wouldn't be able to have a child, Marlene asked a question that would change their lives forever. Can frozen embryos be adoption? The answer to Marlene's question did two things. It brought them their beloved daughter Hannah, and it put them into a political spotlight. Through their relentless perseverance and the pioneer spirit, the Streges, I hope I'm saying that right, have...
Strege.
Strege?
Strege.
Strege has gone on to give thousands of people hope by telling them their own story of frozen embryo adoption. They say our plans aren't necessarily God's plans, which became apparent in how our family was completed in a way we could never have envisioned through embryo adoption. A cause came along with it, advocating for the adoption of frozen embryos as an ethical counter to embryo-destroying embryonic stem cell research. We walk by faith, not by sight, as the Bible instructs, and as a family we were unified in the belief that our story was one worth telling to spread the word, with so many embryos still in frozen storage, about embryo adoption. Says Strege, this compelling story unfolds at the intersection of faith and family, science and politics. Pro-life Christians, those who have experienced infertility or know those who have, and anyone concerned with where science can lead when moral and ethical concerns are ignored, will welcome this book and the sweet face of the baby who might never have been born. John Strege is a writer for Golf Digest and was the longtime sports writer for the Orange County Register and the Los Angeles Times. He's also the author of the best-selling Tiger, a biography of Tiger Woods, and When War Played Through, as well as the co-author of 18 Holes with Bing, with Nathaniel Crosby, Bing Crosby's son. Here to talk about his new book, A Snowflake Named Hannah, history-making story of the first adoption of a frozen embryo, is John Strege?
Strege.
John, welcome to Revealing the Truth.
I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
There's a statement in the beginning of the introduction that says, our plans aren't necessarily God's plans. I would tend to think that this was exactly a plan of God, who orchestrated for you to become a pioneer in a groundbreaking utilization of many of these frozen embryos that were donated and not used. And I think that most of us are just completely ignorant of this world. We do a lot of shows on infertility and adoption. I'm an adopted father. I have a 30-year-old adopted daughter who gave birth to my 7.5-month-old granddaughter. So I'm very familiar with the adoption process, and I'd kind of like to take you back to even way before all this began, because faith is such a strong component of this. Is kind of get a little bit of history from you as to your faith journey and your wife's faith journey, and then when you got married, how you looked at infertility from a biblical perspective, and why you were motivated to go beyond the traditional route and embrace something that was so revolutionary.
Well, we were both Lutheran Church Missouri Synod members from birth. We actually went to the same grade school, Lutheran grade school, 7 years apart. I didn't really know her then. I knew her brother, who was closer in age. And then after college, we got introduced again, and obviously dated and married. To get to this point, she had never had an opportunity to go to college out of high school, and we wanted her to get a degree and have a profession to fall back on in case anything happened to me. before we had kids. And so she did that. She became an occupational therapist, graduated from University of Southern California. And then we started to try to have kids, and we encountered infertility. We went through all the processes to see if we could get pregnant. It didn't work. And finally, she was told she had premature ovarian failure, which means she wasn't going to get pregnant. And at that point, through tears, she asked the doctor, can we adopt embryos? And that started the whole thing. But the first question we had when we got home that day and started talking about it, what would God think about adopting frozen embryos? I mean, this was new frontier. We had no idea. So we discussed it. We had very close friends who were Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastors. We consulted with them. And then my wife listened to Dr. James Dobson's radio show every morning on the way to work. And she wondered what he would think. So she placed a call to focus on the family, to see if this would be acceptable in the eyes of God. She talked to a counselor who couldn't answer it, passed her on to a chaplain who couldn't answer it. And finally, in desperation, she says, is there any way I can get this question to Dr. Dobson? And they told her, or they put her on hold, got a hold of Dr. Dobson's assistant, and then they came back and said, if you can get a letter out to him get a letter to him by Monday. This was on a Friday. He might be able to address it. So we got the letter out on Saturday morning. It arrived on Monday. We didn't hear from him for a week, so we thought, well, she's not going to answer it. And then finally he called on Saturday morning, a week later, and said he had to consult his own people to find out, what this was all about. He'd never been asked this question before. And he got back to us and he says, I can't speak for God, but we think these frozen embryos, if they're not going to be used by the families that produce them, should be adopted. And that sort of started the ball rolling on this whole thing.
I find it very interesting and puzzling. First of all, as a Jew, believing that God knew you before you were in your mother's womb, this is the ultimate example of this embryo that's frozen before it was in its mother's womb. So the rabbinic side of me would say, that's just a straight up simple, well, sure. This is a life. This is already conceived. Therefore, it's not in the classification of in vitro, where we're taking the harvested egg of the mother, the harvested seed of the father, and we're combining those and then implanting that. These are already embryos. So my answer probably would have been very, very quick, because it's not a doctrinal issue for me. It's these were already created. The method in which they were created does not impact the fact that they are already created and are already image bearers. We're a step past that. So, had you called me, I would have said, man, go for it and journal it and chronicle for it. I want to know everything about this. This is phenomenal, and this is a ray of hope for every person struggling with infertility, that becomes another step in the process before formal adoption, like I did, of a newborn baby. So it's groundbreaking. It's revolutionary. It's saying that God is the God of science to have given us the tools to be able to do such a thing. What is the magnitude of how many of these frozen embryos exist?
Right now, there's probably more than 1 million that exist, and and it's an ongoing controversy. You mentioned embryonic stem cell research. It's even though it hasn't produced a single cure, they still want government money to fund this. And we're still fighting it, but yeah, there's more than 1 million. And I want to emphasize, you brought up some good points. We're not advocating IVF. Uh, we're again, these embryos were already created, and they're there, and they need to be given a chance. It's we're trying to solve a problem. There's more than 1 million of these out there, and they all deserve a chance. I don't know that they're all going to get a chance, but we're doing everything we can to make sure they do get a chance.
There is so much talk about the Roe v. Wade, talking about abortion, but this is an undiscussed and undiscovered area of opportunity where a decision has already been made by a family, by a donor family, whether or not they're related or they're independent, and in these laboratories that perform this embryonic creation of the fertilization of an egg and then freezing it and putting it in suspended animation until it can find a suitable home. I think that we're beginning to find that cord blood gathered at the time of the separation of the placenta from the baby, that the blood that's in the cord has many, many properties which are more impactful to research than embryonic stem cell, and opens up a whole opportunity because that blood is an in-between. It's the mother expels the placenta, the cord with the blood in it still attached to that, and in Israel they harvest it. In many hospitals here they harvest it as cord blood for research purposes. That is just smart. That's just simple. That's easy. That's a non-impactful on the life of the embryo, the life of the family. It's just there and has been disposable in the past. Now it is a source of research and understanding.
I was going to say, we actually kept Hannah's cord blood, and to your point, she has access to this in the future if she has any kind of debilitating disease or something. But but you're right. It's the stem cells in cord blood, and they're doing great things with it. Same with adult stem cells. They has proven far more effective using adult stem cells than embryonic stem cells right now, as far as finding solutions to some of these problems.
This is a little bit of a rabbi trail, but in Israel, they just completed their first lung operation that would have been a candidate for a lung transplant here. But they didn't do that. They removed the diseased lung from the patient, treated the diseased lung outside of the body through irradiating the entire lung, which they couldn't do with technology. You can't get into every part of it. It's radiation too broad, and especially in the lung areas, can affect all kinds of other areas. Took it out, treated it, healed it, and put it back in that person's body.
Wow.
My guide in Israel has leukemia. He was told that about every 10 years after your treatments, it may flare up. This last time he said, this idea of getting donors and doing all this, there's got to be something. And they said, well, there is. We have a new program. It's experimental. but it's where we harvest your own blood marrow over a period of time. Then we irradiate it. We kill all of the non-viable cells in it, as if you were a baby. We replant it in you, and then we start you on new immunizations. Measles, mumps, rubella, polio. You have to start all your vaccines over again because you now have the bone marrow of a newborn baby that doesn't have the immunity system. And so he's now 5 years past that transplant of his own. So no rejection, no matching, none of this stuff. This is really speaks to this same issue of us having so much information pre-utero that we can learn and use in, not from a purely academic standpoint, but in the process of adopting an embryo, looking at the DNA components, looking for any anomalies prior to, and even treating, as they do now, either in utero or possibly an application of some medicinal treatment prior to the implantation that would be of assistance. Now, is that playing God? Is that interfering with the alteration of DNA? Or, in my opinion, God's the author of life, and He's equipped us with these tools. If we're not using them for good, if we're using it for evil, then it doesn't matter what it is. You know, the same poker that I stoke my fire with is also a deadly weapon. You know, it's good for this, but it's bad for that. And so
Right.
We need to understand that. So the process for you was that you got an opinion that said that this is something that would be biblical, and adopting, this is a life, therefore the adoption of a child is really what defines a child. Well, the Bible defines life. Life begins at conception. So this is already a conceived life, therefore it qualifies. As you began this process and people became aware of it, did you have a lot of people following you, tracking it, or was it until it was successful that it then became known about?
Yes. Well, I mean, once she got pregnant, once the embryos were implanted or transferred, and she got pregnant, that's when we began to talk about it. But basically, only to family. I mean, you know, you're an adoptive parent. It's your child. I mean, doesn't matter whether it's adopted or not. It's your child. So we weren't going to go public with it, but our families knew. And if I can interject, it was, you know, you were talking about God's plan. You know, our plan was just to have a baby. And when I look back in hindsight, Hannah was born within 2 months of when scientists discovered a way to extract those stem cells from embryos that destroyed the embryos. When I look back, and you know, and that started this whole controversy, it looks to me like this definitely was God's plan. They needed some human faces to show what was at stake here in destroying embryos. And it wasn't just us; other couples followed. But yeah, you made a great point. This is definitely looks like God's plan. It certainly wasn't our plan, but we love the way it turned out.
You know, the idea of me going to a laboratory and having an embryo created, barrenness and all these things that had implications in the Bible related to sin or allowing God's plan to unfold so God would get the glory. Your approach to this has been that God's going to get the glory for this miracle of life called Hannah. And your story is so compelling. I'm so enthralled with the idea that your wife would think to ask a question that apparently has not been asked before.
Yeah, there's no question. And we might have discussed it before that final doctor's visit where she was told she had premature ovarian failure, but only in passing. And so when she raised the question, it was, wow. And then, afterwards, when we got back together at home and started talking about it, as you said earlier, and I said in the book, we walk by faith, not by sight, and we walked by faith. We had no idea where this was headed, whether we could pull it off or not. We just kept following the cues as they came along. So we've been blessed for sure.
What year are we talking about here that was the beginning of this process?
It was January of 1997 when my wife Marlene posed that question.
In the 23 years that have passed, what stage are we in this process of being able to adopt embryos, and is it a part of the OB/GYN's arsenal of options now being offered as standard?
Well, we went through an agency called Nightlight Christian Adoptions. We're located out in Orange County, California, because we knew the executive director at the time, and he was placed, he became part of the, let me rephrase that. We've known him for going back to grade school. My wife babysat his kids. It was like God put this man in our life, and he wasn't into adoptions at that point. He was an attorney, and God put him in our life 25 years before Hannah came along. So now we want to go through this, and his name was Ron Stoddard, and I do think he's a hero of our story. So we met with him to talk about adoption, and he ran through international adoptions that the agency did, domestic adoptions. He says it's not are you going to have a child, it's when you're going to have a child or how you're going to have a child. And then Marlene brought up the embryo adoption thing, and he was vaguely aware of all these embryos in frozen storage, but he never hesitated. When Marlene was done explaining what was going on, he says, yeah, we can do that. And he took the ball and ran with it. He did not have to do that. He was going to Russia all the time to help arrange adoption of Russian orphans. It was a very busy man, and he said, yeah, we can do it. And since then, and they started the Snowflake's embryo adoption program at Nightlight Christian Adoptions. And to date, just from that agency, more than 700 babies have been born. But that's not the only agency now doing it. Ron and Nightlight Christian Adoptions shared all the information. Here's how we're doing it with other agencies around the country. So, thousands of kids have been saved and rescued from frozen orphanages to this date, and more as we go into the future. There will be a lot more babies saved.
Praise God. I adopted my daughter out of Fallbrook, California. I lived in Los Angeles.
That's where I lived.
Yeah, I lived in Diamond Bar at the time. I worked down at the Beaudry Center in L.A. and worked with an attorney and an adoption agency, and I got a newborn baby out of Fallbrook. That's just the love of my life and the joy of my heart. And as you know, in California, when the judge makes his declaration, he has a statement he makes, and the statement he makes is very important to me as a Jew. It says that from this day forward, this child will be entitled to every God-given right as if she were your natural-born child. Judaism recognizes adoption as the child being born Jewish.
Mm-hmm.
That is so important to the Jew. Might not be as important to the Gentile, but to the Jew it's very important because it has to do with opportunity for citizenship in Israel and for acceptance into the Jewish community. So it's very important to me to hear those words and to have them stick in my mind from that courtroom in California, that if you adopted in California, you heard the exact same words spoken by the judge, because that's the standard adoption creed. We're talking with John, give me your last name, is Strege?
Strege, yep.
Strege, John Strege, author of a new book called A Snowflake Named Hannah, Ethics, Faith, and the First Adoption of a Frozen Embryo, the unique true story that ignited a new pro-life movement. Hundreds of thousands of frozen embryos exist, held in stasis, because parents using in vitro fertilization have completed their families without them. Science discovered a way to extract stem cells from them, and that destroyed the embryo.
Correct.
However, in 1997, the question was asked by a mother longing to have a child of her own. Can you adopt one of these frozen embryos? Are they a life in God's economy? They're fertilized. They are now an embryo. They're not a separate egg. They're now together. They are a life in God's eyes. And if He knew you before you were in your mother's womb, He knows that test tube sitting on a rack with other test tubes carrying a number, but when God looks at it, He sees His image and how His image is being created and passed on to a new generation, a different way. A breakthrough story, a story that is emotional, transparent, identifies a huge opportunity for families pursuing adoption and finding a new way when you thought every way had been tried. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about the movement that was birthed out of this adoption and how it's growing and how you can tap into it as we continue with John Strege, A Snowflake Named Hannah, Ethics, Faith, and the First Adoption of a Frozen Embryo. We'll be right back. The Lord meets you right where you are, and so does Igniting a Nation's new live streaming outlets. You can now watch Revealing the Truth, Revealing the Bible, and Prophecy Revealed simulcast live each Monday through Friday from 10 a.m. to 1 o'clock p.m. Central Standard Time on YouTube Live, Facebook Live, Vimeo, Periscope, and through our website, www.ignitinganation.com. No matter what device you are using, our program will automatically scale so you won't have to miss a single program. And if you happen to miss an episode, you can always subscribe to the Igniting a Nation YouTube channel and access over 1,000 interviews and never miss your favorite authors, special guests, and topics that interest you the most.
There are lots of ways to see Israel, but nothing compares to seeing the land of the book and the people of the book through the eyes of two Jewish believers who can take you on a journey that will bring the entire Bible to life. When you join Rabbi Eric Walker and his #1 rated tour guide, Edo Canaan in Israel, you'll experience incredible teachings, first-class accommodations, and actually walk where Jesus walked. You will experience the Bible transforming from black and white into living color, and you will never see the Bible in the same way again. For more information, visit us at www.ignitinganation.com/events.
The Lord contends with what contends with you, and Igniting a Nation is committed to bringing to light each and every issue that faces a believer's life. Our live stream programming and teachings take you on a journey to finding biblical truth from a wide variety of experts who share their insights into a deeper walk with the Lord. We have assembled the most comprehensive panel of experts in the fields of prophecy, caregiving, healing from trauma, shame, and abuse, and so much more. We continue to expand our teachings and programming to meet your needs. We're committed to healing the nations with biblical truth. Visit www.ignitinganation.com to develop a deeper walk with the Lord and start your journey to a transformed life. The Bible commands us to study to show ourselves approved, but most study using Bible study tools and not actually studying the Bible chapter and verse. Igniting a Nation is pleased to present Revealing the Bible, recorded and taught each week before a live audience. We take you deeper into the actual Bible and verse in both Hebrew and English and connect the dots between the Old and New Testament. You can attend our 2 classes in Tuscaloosa and Birmingham, or watch the program every Wednesday at 11 a.m. Central Time on ignitinganation.com and all our other simulcast outlets. For more information, visit www.ignitinganation.com/events. Shalom and welcome back to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. We're talking with John Strege, author of A Snowflake Named Hannah, Ethics, Faith, and the First Adoption of a Frozen Embryo. John, welcome back to the program.
Thank you.
John, I'm up on the nightlight.org website, and it is really a embryo adoption program that you, I think, were probably one of the catalysts to their existence, because there were so many questions to come out of this that needed to have legal answers, legislative answers. There's a lot of things involved in whether or not this can be recognized, and through its recognition, it clearly establishes that life begins at conception. And it is it's a Three Stooges poke in the eye to the pro-choice definition of terminate at any point, you're not taking a life. And this is now supported medically, and this organization is one, I'm sure, of more than one, but this is the one that you involved. Embryo adoption allows the family with remaining embryos to select a recipient family for their embryo gifts. So now you have people who can proactively, who have donated and are not going to use, can actually get involved in the process proactively in helping find a home for their embryonic child. How beautiful a picture could that possibly be when we have a situation where, in a typical adoption, the birth mother might look through a bunch of catalogs of families, read a bunch of stories, maybe meet with a couple of families and make a decision as to who she would like to be the adoptive parents. It's orchestrated by an agency, facilitated by an attorney. Here you have an embryo, but to the mother and father that donated this, it is a child to them looking for a home. What a amazing picture in the earliest stages, not where I had to wait until the baby came out, but what if I was there of the moment of not conception, but the moment of engagement, the moment when it became ours, not 9 months later, but now.
Yep.
That you actually could experience what traditional adoption and adoptees and adoptive parents cannot. As an adopted father, my daughter exhibits personality traits universal across the adoptive child community. There is a certain underlying, although she knows that God chose me to be her dad, there's that underlying rejection, a little bit of, unsettling, hard to, we've been to many who specialize, and they say it's pretty uniform, pretty universal. But this eliminates that by having a full-term pregnancy and having all the experiences, all the endorphins that are released, all of the pregnancy experiences and delivery experiences, which also have their own unique bonding when there is a vaginal birth versus a C-section birth or an adoption of a child that's already born. This is the closest replica to traditional childbirth.
Yes.
And
I'll even go one step further to interrupt you. We actually have photos of the day the frozen embryos were thawed. This was a straw of 3 of them. Only one survived the transfer, but we have photos of the day they were thawed and then the next day when we were going in for the transfer, and they'd already moved on to their next stage of development. So, in the traditional pregnancy, you don't have access, you're not seeing the embryos, but we actually saw the embryos at that point, and you could tell they changed from one day to the next. I mean, it is definitely life begins at conception, and this was life.
With this kind of irrefutable evidence that's existed for quite some time, the history of in vitro or embryonic creation of a test tube baby, if you will,
Right.
has been around for a long time. And by science saying that it is a viable life, answers the question as to when does life begin. So is this also a case to support that life begins at conception, whether it's in the body or outside of the body, that this life begins to grow and change embryonically?
Well, this is why we shouldn't do research on them. You made a great point. I've included in the book there, in 1948, after World War II, there was a Declaration of Geneva adopted by the General Assembly of the World Medical Association. And one of the articles of that was, I will maintain, this is for doctors, they're basically talking about, I will maintain the utmost respect for human life from the time of conception. Well, these are already been conceived. But I also will note that in 1983, they changed that article to read they removed from the time of conception to from its beginning. And I think the only reason they did that is they didn't want to admit that life begins at conception, and it made it easier to justify abortion and embryonic stem cell research going forward. But I mean, they knew after the German atrocities in World War II, listen, life begins at conception, and we should maintain the utmost respect for this life.
The whole subject is so fascinating. It's such a word of encouragement to families that struggle with infertility. And it's something that should be in the arsenal of every OBGYN to be able to offer this as the possibly last step in the process, because if the body does not reject the embryo, then the embryo is going to be viable and grow and be a child. Have there been enough done to give a statistical analysis of acceptance and rejection rates?
Well, it takes a considerable, you've got to, not all these embryos survive the thaw. They're in frozen storage. You thaw them. I mean, we adopted 20 embryos from a family who we've got the utmost respect for. We love them, but 20 embryos, and they, very few survive the thaw. They have to survive the thaw and then the transfer. So it's, when I say there's more than 1 million frozen embryos out there, they're not all going to be viable, but so you have to consider that. I don't know what the actual odds would be, but that's just something to consider. Again, 20 embryos, we got 1 child out of it. But still, it's, they deserve a chance.
Absolutely. And by recognizing them as a person, not as a petri dish,
right,
that gives a great deal of dignity.
When Hannah was younger, she was aware of her story, and she wanted to name the other 19. She wanted to acknowledge that, this is human life. And so as a family, we gave names to all the other 19, which I've included. Well, Hannah wrote about it in the foreword to the book,
right.
All the names we came up with. I thought that was, I don't remember how old she was at the time when she decided that, but, we love the fact that she came up with that idea.
What are some of the roadblocks that you are facing in advancing the cause of adoption of embryos?
Only the embryonic stem cell research issue, which doesn't go away. I'm out in California. In 2004, they passed a bond measure committing $3 billion. It still hasn't produced a single cure. Now, and they've run out of money. Now they're looking for $5.5 billion in another bond measure for the November ballot. And, it's an ongoing battle. George W. Bush vetoed spending federal money on embryonic stem cell research, which was reversed by Barack Obama and is still in place under President Trump. And we're trying to get to President Trump to, consider this, quit spending federal dollars on embryonic stem cell research. It'd be so much better spent on adult stem cell research or any other thing, but destroying embryos is not the way to go.
What kind of feedback have you received from anybody in government and ministry to come alongside of you to move this to the next level of possibly forming ministries or having you speaking into adoption agencies or bringing awareness? I know the book is just released and this is the first step in that process, but what plans do you have? What is God unfolding for you as you're coming across opportunities to talk to people like myself?
Well, last week we were at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, Hopefully the book will help. But my wife is really the go-getter on this. She's tied into so many different people back in Washington, D.C., not necessarily elected officials, but people working on pro-life causes. My daughter Hannah is a senior at Biola University, and she wants to get into social work to advance this cause. So we're not giving up on this. Writing the book is not the end of it. We're going to be involved for the rest of our lives, I think.
Well, it's a fascinating concept. It's something that is new and exciting, and we are just absolutely interested in this because it clearly establishes that the scientific community supports the definition of life begins at conception, and it's irrefutable. And by allowing for even the adoption of one frozen embryo and acknowledging it as life absolutely dispels every argument of the pro-choice movement that says that life begins in these various stages. No, there is only one starting point, and this is evidence of that starting point, and it cannot be refuted because it's established by the medical community, who's funding research into and tracking and looking at changes that are taking place. I think this is going to be a breakthrough work. I think you're going to be cited and quoted by many, and that you will become a pro-life champion because of this action that you and your wife took. So I pray blessings over you, and I thank you. I want to encourage our audience to read this, especially those that are pro-life, to arm yourself with some tool, another tool in your arsenal that you did not have, and that is a book called A Snowflake Named Hannah, Ethics, Faith, and the First Adoption of a Frozen Embryo by John Strege. You can visit ignitingnation.com, click on today's broadcast schedules. You'll see his name. It says, "Love the interview." Buy the book and get that book and get it into the hands of those that are maybe struggling with infertility or a cause that you believe in taking up the cause of pro-life, not pro-choice. John Strege, thank you for sharing this amazing story with us here on Revealing the Truth.
Thank you for having me, and God bless.
God bless you. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.